Anyway, really quickly before we move into the final closing statements, I would invite you guys, if you've written any questions down, if you would begin to pass those for this section over here toward the inside of the row for these two sections. You guys to your right, this section to your left, and this section to the closest end here. We'll send people around to collect those before we get to the closing statements and into the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, in my last 5 minutes, let me try to say just a few words to meet Professor McCormick at least halfway or partway on some of the points he made in his 10-minute rebuttal, and then just close with a few thoughts about how tonight's discussion and debate actually is part of an ongoing story that you can see unfolding even within the pages of the early Christian documents. First, let me take up the Salem witch trials example, since that was the last point he made. I admit my historical ignorance of this trial, but I applaud Professor McCormick's insistence that we try to apply consistently any sort of argument, whether for or against a certain sort of hypothesis, to things beyond just the one that we're considering right now. So I think that he's exactly on the right track there to say, look, try to apply these same sorts of tests to Salem. Try to apply them to other religions that you might not happen to find persuasive. See whether or not they match up in those cases as well. However, I'm not convinced, just by the brief description he's given, that the witchcraft really did not happen at all in Salem. And I think that if you attend to the historical evidence and you decide that witchcraft really did not happen at all in Salem, there might be another adequate explanation of that, which is that judicial systems are far from perfect. Even though I used a jury case as my main analogy, I'm happy to admit that judicial systems, whether with 12 people in a room or whether in some other structure, do not always invariably give you the correct answer. Indeed, a casual reading of the New Testament would show you that Jesus' trial and eventual crucifixion happened at the hands of one of the best legal systems of the day. And likewise, Stephen's eventual trial in the Jewish court of the Sanhedrin. Let me say a word about the ash effect that Professor McCormick mentioned. I actually think in this case, well, first of all, let me admit that it is a powerful effect and that it can happen to make people not see things that are plainly staring them in the face. But I think that the ash effect can actually cut in favor of the resurrection hypothesis. After all, even though the disciples were in a community with each other, they were also surrounded by a much larger community of people who were deniers of the resurrection and who had very strong motives, both religious and secular, to make sure that the early Christian movement did not take off and spring up. The fact that they were able to maintain their story and consolidate it and keep holding on to it in the face of so many people arguing against it, I think speaks to the resiliency of their experience rather than its fragility. I'm kind of curious to ask Professor McCormick a question that he's sometimes asked me, but in a different sort of form. Since the structure of his rebuttal has primarily attacked whether the 4 facts that I mentioned really should count as facts, I'm curious to know whether he would agree with the second move in my argument. If, for the sake of discussion, we were to admit the 4 facts as genuine, bona fide historical facts, would the best explanation of that be that God raised Jesus from the dead? I'm inclined to think that it is, but it could be that some of our deeper philosophical disagreements actually swirl around that second part of the argument more than the first. Finally, let me say just a word or two about what you will see if you read through the early Christian writing that's known as the Acts of the Apostles. It's usually thought of as the second part in a 2-part installment beginning with Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and then Acts. One of the things you'll see is that Paul goes to Athens in chapter 17, and he presents an argument about the resurrection. And there are 3 reactions to it. The philosophers at Athens largely kind of jeer him and say, we don't believe in the resurrection from the dead. Who wants to continue to have a body after all? The soul is more important than the body. A few people said, we'd like to hear you again on this topic. And then an even fewer number of people actually believed in him and became Christians at that event. I think that story illustrates that people back then were just about as careful and skeptical as we are now. Second story, also from the book of Acts, much later, when Paul is not in front of a Greek-speaking audience or a Greek-thinking audience of philosophers, but a Roman audience of government officials. Paul says in his trial before Festus and Felix that the resurrection happened, and you can believe it, you can take it to the bank. And he begins to question one of the Roman officials. He says, "You believe the prophets, don't you? I know you do." And the Roman official says, "Paul, do you think that you can convince me to be a Christian in such a short time?" Paul says, "Whether short time or long, I hope that everyone here will be what I am, yet without my chains." Paul was in chains at that time. You know, in the jury trial that I mentioned at the beginning, it took us 5 days of full-day deliberations to reach a verdict on this particular case. And I'm not even going to tell you what the verdict was. But what that shows to me is that people know how to be careful. People know how to think through evidence carefully. And sometimes it takes a long time. Even if you weren't persuaded, one side or the other, by the end of tonight's presentation, I hope that you'll keep an open mind and keep on researching the question. And I'm convinced that if you do so, you'll be led to the kind of position that I've defended tonight. Thanks.